When I talk about comics, what I usually mean is the medium, the panels and the colours and the lines. But in this one, I want to talk about the form of the comic book, and how Jonathan Hickman and Tom Muller used design pages in House of X and Powers of 10 to transform the way the comic book is read. You're watching Strip Panel Naked, I'm Hass, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. So I'm less interested in the specifics of those pages and, kind of the content of them, than in the way that they're used within the surrounding story, and how that impacts the perception of it through my eyes. I do think Powers of 10 number 4 is a good case study to explore this, so I'll mostly be using pages from that issue. But first, let's just clarify what those pages actually do. They're essentially additional story information, like you might find in an appendix in a book. So they supplement the things that are happening in the standard comic book medium story pages. Like a chart that might explain the multiple timelines of a character, or a graph or a newsletter from a character that you've just seen, or whatever else. And when you add text pages into a comic in this way, it serves to show the fictional and constructed nature of everything around it. There's an argument for suspension of disbelief to be maintained as strongly as possible throughout any story, to grasp the reader and hook them in. That is storytelling 101. Get the reader emotionally invested in the story, and then don't break anything else, because the moment that you break that, they'll jump out of the story. And that's exactly what these design pages actually do, because they stop you. They essentially halt the story in place to add exposition to what you've just read. It just announces the artifice of everything, and it draws attention to the fact that you're reading a story. Now, it might sound like I'm being negative about these pages, but you have to believe that there is a reason that they exist like that, and I think there is, because in this way it becomes something like a historical document to the narrative. It works similar to factual information in the documentary, like these graphics pages are the talking heads, interviews straight from someone that can give you the direct information, and the narrative sequences then become the kind of dramatic reconstructions. And it reveals something about the form of the comic and the narrative, because it starts to feel to me like non-fiction principles. And this is where Muller's design comes in, because all of his design pages fit within the same world, which I'm using in air quotes, as the contents page. So all these various design documents, be they the Sinister newsletter or charts or diary entries, they aren't formatted in ways like, say, the end of the Watchmen chapters present a magazine or a novel interior. In that instance, they're created as though they are an actual thing in that world, right? They are laid out and they look like the thing they're supposed to be. In Powers of 10 and House of X, the documents are all within the same design guidelines. It's very firmly placed outside of the world within the comic pages in that way, essentially just being pure information. And I do think that's really important, because it doesn't need to have this wrapping as Watchmen does. So much of it can exist without narrative reasoning or cause, which opens up how the information can be presented to the reader, which means you can be told anything. It's being very upfront about the role of those pages in this story, allowing the focus to be on the information and not the presentation. And that's compounded when you think of the timelessness of this series of House of X and Powers of 10, because it's a story that takes place through multiple iterations of the same timeline, then becomes particularly interestingly intertwined with this concept, because really what we see in House of X and Powers of 10 is the past. The series can be seen as something of kind of a retrospective explainer series that sets up the new range of X-Men titles. And the team do this by these resetting timelines and building towards an eventual future that the comic already argues has happened, which means that much of it is really just filling in the space of dramatic reconstruction. So having these moments that physically break the narrative storytelling to fill in background information also helps solidify that narrative as something that is being specifically told, that you are hearing about something that has already happened. A lot of comics will tell you a story as though the thing is unfolding right in front of you. House of X and Powers of 10, I think, is very upfront about the fact that what you're seeing is a retrospective. And the way that Hickman, Muller and co control that somewhat is in the placement of these design pages, because they all come at the end of a sequence. In Powers of 10-4, you can see that each time a scene ends, you get given a design page, like a capping point for that moment. You can see it in House of X 4-2, which is one whole sequence and therefore has no mid-issue design pages. So these pages then function more than the surface level exposition that they appear to, but instead as a way to frame this entire series as something more akin to a history of X. The design pages don't just add to the background, but they completely change the way you experience and approach this series. They can't not do that. It utilizes the comic form in a very, very different way, in a very, very interesting way. An episode of documentary storytelling that feels like a dive into the history of a world in a way that doesn't just want to present itself as straight narrative. And the final addition to this is the small document info pieces on the design pages. These small tags, like the brackets 0.01 underscore Hume underscore 03 close brackets, that indicate these pages are being pulled from a larger database of files and folders. The collective history of the story as found in some machine or hard drive. There's a clear second layer of narrative that the design pages work in, themselves further adding to the story presented in the overall package of a single issue of House of X and Powers of 10. The fact it matches the contents page means that this is a layer completely above the dramatic reconstructions of the narrative we see in the standard comic book pages. And honestly, at the start of this series, I wasn't the biggest fan of the way the exposition initially appeared to be shunted onto these pages, which on first read to me seemed more like a way to kind of tack on world building without adding more weight to the story pages. You know, ultimately that is what Hickman and Muller pull off, but by thinking smartly about where they sit in the story and how the narrative pages then work around them, they've created a great interplay between a kind of exposition dump and an unfolding story with it. And ultimately it gives the series like a really unique style, an interesting distance to the story, and a documentary feeling of seeing a story that has already happened, rather than developing in real time. And that may seem like a small difference, but honestly, if you revisit House of X and Powers of 10, you can see just how different the actual tone of the comics would have been without them. Or even if they'd have worked as more in-world design like Watchmen's chapter endings, it would have been a completely different experience. House of X and Powers of 10 becomes essentially an argument for mainstream superhero documentary comics, and it makes a great point for that formal function to be revisited in other series. Thanks for watching. If you're a fan of Strip Panel Naked, we do have a Patreon page where for your support you'll get access to literally years of extra content and writing. And you can find me on Twitter at HassanOE and my Eisner award-winning magazine Panel by Panel at panelxpanel.com. And finally, hit subscribe and that notification bell to keep up to date with all the latest episodes, and I'll see you next time.